that's why at the end I did Melancholy and Demonstrations, which was in a way the answer to what is your story of the dictatorship. And in fact, Melancholy and Demonstrations was the story of my mother, who was in a way literature teacher during the dictatorship, and the universities were all intervened by the military dictatorship. So most of the teachers had to leave their position in the university if they were not agreeing to the regime. So my mother was working in the university, and then the military dictatorship came, and then she had to leave the university. And I was born, and then she got depressed. And this is a depression that it's lasting like for, I don't know, 40 years. So it's like, it's the starting of something different. So when I did the Melancholy and Demonstration, it was about the traces of dictatorship, but in another way, in a way of like, how many people can get depressed after the totalitarian regime like this. You know, it's not only how many people were killed, how many people went to exile, how many people, you know, supported it, but how many people were like psychologically destroyed. And it was the way to, in a way, answer the question of what is your story? That was always present when I did this piece, because it was a story of my generation, but there was always somebody else telling his story or her story, and that was the way I found to tell my story. And it was a piece that I did based on a text I wrote, which was not a dramatic text, it was just like a kind of, it was a text with short chapters that were describing different things in the life of my, in the life of my mother and my life, and I put it on stage with a group of actors that were 70 and 80 years old. And there was an actress who is there in the mattress, who was somehow playing the role of my mother. But what was interesting as a procedure that I discovered during the rehearsals was that I decided not to work with archive in the way that I work in the other pieces, like using photos and documents like letters and recordings. But I decided to interview my mother about her life and the depression and the dictatorship and everything. And then this actress would do lip sync with the voice of my mother. So she would open her mouth and the voice of my mother would come out, which is almost like constructing your own nightmare. You know what I mean? Like, there is this kind of person that looks like your mother, and when she opens her mouth, the voice of your mother comes out. And you are there on stage with this person. So it was really like horror. And I didn't realize that. It's also, that's the point of this kind of project. You don't realize until you're like really there, what have you done? And it was also interesting to work with these old performers, because it was also about stage in the past, but with very like with people who were between 70 and 80 years old, and you had this feeling that the past is in their bodies, and I was somehow also interested. Now we're going from babies to 80 years old performers, on how, you know, we are used to see on stage always like use, you know, like the use, the power of the performer, you know, and we're not used to see vulnerable, slow people on stage, you know, like people who are in a way showing, you know, not a very like how to say, virtuous performance. It's more that they are there with their bodies, with their presence, with the way they speak. And I was really surprised about how interesting it is to work with people who are not, in a way they are not trained actors. I mean, they were like studying acting, but they started to do acting when they were older, so it was like a hobby for them. But somehow they had this presence there that was very interesting, especially when the piece was talking about death and melancholy and, you know, like living with this disease of depression. So it was very unique also to work with them and to accept, for example, as I had to accept that the baby was not able to perform like the things I wanted in the moment where I wanted, that I had to adapt to the baby. I had to adapt to the fact that these old actors will always forget their lives and their movements on stage. So, you know, like sometimes they would go in the wrong direction or they would say the wrong line, and we had to like, well, and it was beautiful because of that too, because we were at some point, but it was interesting because at the beginning I had this idea of a very complicated text that they had to say, which was a chorus with many layers, and they had to be very ta-ta-ta-ta. And then I put like a projection of the text in front of them for them to perform and see the text. You know, behind the audience there was a big projection for them to read. And then I realized they were like this, you know. Like and then at some point I gave up to this, with this idea. And sometimes it's really interesting, you know, to know as an artist when you are going for something that is really complicated and difficult to get, but you know that it makes sense. And sometimes you have this crazy idea and you have to give up, and you have to see what is in front of you, and you're not able to see, you know, like, because you're obsessed with your idea.